Salon Culture, Culture Action Europe podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Culture Action Europe podcast series dedicated to the European elections. The elections will take place between the 23rd and 26th of May 2019, and until then, Culture Action Europe is present at the European Parliament to discuss a few key topics related to culture with the European Party's representatives. Our intent is to discover the position of these representatives on fundamental questions such as freedom of artistic expression, mobility of cultural workers, and the place of culture in our society and in the digital age. In this episode, it's my great pleasure to receive Ms. Gloanec Maurin. Thank you for joining this podcast.
Bonjour et merci de cette invitation.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me. To start us off, it seems like the idea of European values and European unity, which are considered acquired a long time ago, are more and more challenged. According to you, what role can culture play to improve a positive integration of Europe? It's an essential role, and that's why I'm extremely sensible to this issue, even if for this mandate I am not directly taking part in the Committee on Culture and Education, but in other important committees such as Agriculture and Budget. For me, this cultural dimension at the European level is essential because it can build a European story that allows all EU citizens to feel the common ground that we share, the story we have built since millennia, and not only since the creation of the European Union. The EU is very important and we need to preserve the way it's built. But beyond the EU, there is a necessity to give each one of us the vision which allows us to think that we have a common legacy in this European continent. And this is what culture can build via artistic expressions, obviously. And that is the reason why we need to support artistic creation, but also through spaces that allow for cohesion and the political cohesion that supports this cultural dimension. I think it should always be encouraged, like it was done for many years with essential mechanisms such as Erasmus, which also build the European culture. There are programs that the EU unfortunately does not support far enough, but are essential to create this cultural dimension. Twinnings, for example, or the European capitals of culture, that constitute our common ground. It's for this reason that culture is part of the fundamental values of the EU. Culture is not often mentioned because we usually prefer to debate the economic questions at the European level. But I regret this, because we must return substance to this continent, and we need the 500 million citizens to feel we have a common identity. Yes, and in this common European culture, there is also a lot of diversity, of course, and we can also observe reactions to cultural diversity that are somehow hostile. How can the EU support cultural diversity in such a context, both online and offline? As you know, since quite a few years, since 2005, cultural diversity has seriously been taken into account at the European level. You are right when you say that this is a dimension that is sometimes attacked, because diversity, it's also about accepting the other, accepting difference. And when I was saying that we have a common culture, yes, we do, but a diversity that actually carries our project, united in diversity, it is because we have this very strong feeling that we can be different and united at the same time. And so this diversity is of course supported by texts, all of the conventions that we have signed at the UNESCO, but also those carried out by the European Union since 2005. There are also other conventions, such as the one of Faro, which covers our cultural heritage. This is extremely important. Or, furthermore, Freiburg Declaration, which supports cultural rights. This dimension of cultural rights at the European level is also very important and really supports the notion of cultural diversity, because it gives a responsibility to each one of the EU citizens to carry culture. I think it's extremely important to refer to these texts to support the cultural dimensions at the European level. And in the same way, online and offline, we observe new obstacles for freedom of artistic expression. Would you support a European regulation to guarantee freedom of artistic expression? Of course, I would support this idea. It would be formidable that a regulation be voted for a defence mechanism that would guarantee freedom of expression. We have done this in my country, France, with the law called LCAP, Law for the Creation of Architecture and Heritage, where in one of the first two articles, freedom of expression and creation are mentioned. It's very important, because today, at the European level, there are member states that ignore these fundamental values, and in particular the values of freedom of expression. And so it would be real progress to be able to defend freedom of artistic expression in a more formal way. Another problem for cultural workers today is that the conditions in which they work are often inappropriate. This situation is amplified by the Uberization of work that we can now find across the whole society. What role can the EU play in facilitating better conditions for artists and cultural workers? As you know, the 12th of September last year, we voted a reform of the copyrights for writers, but also applicable to artists and journalists. I mention this nuance because this is what allowed the vote of the text in the second reading in plenary. This text is now in the trilogue phase, where it is debated between the Commission, the Council, and the Parliament who voted it. I hope it will improve further the remunerations of cultural workers and artists, because it challenges in particular the GAFAs, the powerful companies in the digital world, on the way that they use content and the internet, and very often the way that they don't pay or credit artists. So it's an obligation and an injunction given to the GAFAs, and this is important. Beyond this important text, which I hope will return from the trilogue as a directive driving a good reform of these rights, there is also a need to support the member states and their regions. You know that since a few years, the endowments given to municipalities are getting smaller and smaller, and that the subsidies connected to cultural and artistic projects have decreased as well. And so there is a need for the EU to find a way to accompany artists in their creation through the existing supporting programmes. The EU needs to incentivise in the different regions through the existing programmes, but there is a need to integrate. By the way, you know that in the upcoming programme, I am part of the Committee on Budget, where we work on the new programme 2021 to 2027. And in the new programme, which is called Invest EU, that is going to replace the Juncker investment plan. There is the possibility to invest in the cultural sector, and this is very important to support cultural actions in our member states. The career of artists and cultural workers can require travelling, which can contribute to the improved access to culture and promote cultural diversity. But there is still a lot of obstacles on that front, in particular for those coming from outside the EU. Do you think that the EU should take an initiative to facilitate issuing Schengen visas for artists and cultural workers? It is necessary, really, to act on this front, because, as you know, in cultural events we host European artists, of course, but also artists from 5 continents, and from countries who don't always allow freedom of movement. And in particular, I'm thinking of the African continent. In the region where I'm elected, in Limoges, in the centre of France, there is a festival called Les Francophonies, which presents artistic creations, and in particular theatre and cinematography, from all the French-speaking regions of the world. And so this festival hosts artists from Africa in particular, and I realise it's always difficult to obtain visas for these artists. This mobility dimension for artists needs to be supported, because unfortunately it's always difficult for African populations to get out of their country. And it is even more the case for artists because they're suspected to want to stay away from their home country. And so we need to reinforce this dimension. I think it's essential for artistic creation to circulate better. In the digital age, with technology and globalization accelerating, interpersonal skills are becoming more and more important. In this context, what is your position for the consolidation of a common cross-sectorial strategy for culture and education at the European level? I am particularly sensitive to this because I wrote a note to my party for the upcoming campaign, a note that stands for better access to culture, but also to support the youth and social cohesion. With education, we can better comprehend the European dimension, because artistic education opens a new vision that can be very strong and through which we can better comprehend European history. How, for instance, an important movement like the Revolution was born on the banks of the Loire and Arno rivers, how we can understand and grasp all this. And so, always putting education and culture forward to promote a politics of culture is extremely important. I always supported artistic and cultural education. I think that at the European level, it's important. And when I talk about the Erasmus programme, I highlight that this programme is a big success. By the way, it's become Erasmus Plus for a wider scope than just supporting students, as it now supports the apprentices and people who are already out of education. And this is very important, as well as the other programmes that fuse with this programme. And I think when a young person benefits from an Erasmus scholarship to travel through the European continent, there should be an obligation to pass a training module or study a manual that tells the story of Europe from Homer until today to better understand European history. You know, there's a prominent European figure called Karine Gloanec who describes Europe as this little tail of Asia that falls into the Western seas. This is really something other than just the institutions that are very precious, but there is a geography, populations, a common history. And I think through education programs such as Erasmus, Comenius or others, we need to add a dimension of history of our continent, because this is the way we're going to become more European. This is the way we're going to become more open to others, enabled by an artistic education and acceptance of diversity. And this is the way we can become better Europeans.
Et
Considering the large number of initiatives that could be undertaken in the area of culture at the European level, what is your position on the doubling of the budget for culture in Europe? So, as I am in the Committee for Budget, I have a particular responsibility for this. And I see we already have planned an important increase of the budget, because in the next cycle we're going to go from €1.46 billion to €1.85 billion. It's a nice increase. We need to highlight it and not only see the glass as half empty. I think it's already a good progress. But it's not enough because, of course, it's tiny. First of all, the global European budget, is a small percentage of the average GDP of a European country, so it's really small. It's like, to give you an image, the equivalent of 1 coffee per day per citizen. This is what each citizen gives to the EU for the various policies and responsibilities that we need to fulfill. So we need to appreciate this evolution brought by the programme Europe Creative in the next cycle. I think we need to be realistic and already consider the very acceptable evolution of the budget in the next programme. But politically and symbolically, ask for double the budget for culture in the EU. That would be a symbolic way to say that culture is what creates our union. Ms. Gloanec Maurin, thank you very much for taking part in this podcast interview. Thank you. Goodbye. To participate in the Culture Action Europe campaign dedicated to the European elections and to get engaged for the future we want for culture in Europe, simply click on the link in the episode notes. You can also join us to discuss these challenges, among others, in the live dialogue organised by Culture Action Europe on April the 25th on www.jamart.eu. You will also find more information about this upcoming session in the episode notes as well. Thank you for following. Feel free to browse other episodes of this series and share with your friends and colleagues.